Now let's see a concept of chaining. In earlier videos we saw that then, catch, and we also discussed something like finally, but at many points I hinted that they can be chained, they can be written one after another. Here we are going to see the exact syntax. Something like promise.then, definitely we are having this thing, but you can also do something like promise.then, and after that again you can write promise.then. Okay, so what is happening is that what is happening here, now you might understand that okay, this promise, this original promise, I know that so let's remove this syntax, this one is fine. I know that this data is going to be my this data is going to be my resolved data from the URL which I'm pointing to, right? So that resolved data is coming here. But if I do something like this again, so let's say I do again dot then something like this. If I write something like this, then what is this data, this second data? Let's try to print this, and let's put a let's some double arrow to show that what is this printed. So you'll see that, yeah, it has run, and it is printing undefined. See, it has run, which means that even after the completion of this thing is running, and that is expected. Why? Because just now we mentioned that catch will only run when there is some error, right? But then this p dot then, this whole thing is going to give us a promise, right? Now this whole thing is giving us promise, then I can apply another dot then, because dot then is available on all promises, right? So I can write another dot then, and this whole thing is again a promise. From here till here, again a promise, and again I can apply dot catch. So generally this is the practice to have though this thing is again a promise, this whole thing is again a promise, so technically you can write again after this also, you can write another then, right? but yeah, but we'll see that this is thing. So actually you can do something here, and from there here you can create another some resolve value. We will see that how the focus of our attention right now is that what this data is, that data is coming undefined, right? So how we can get some data here. The idea is that the JavaScript specification allows that, generally you must have seen right now, that till now we just do something in then, we just do something in catch, we just do something in finally. Actually in those functions, those callback functions of those methods, we can also return some value. So let's return something from here. So let's return 100. What happens to this? Actually p dot then, this whole thing is a promise, but if you return something from inside the most recent then that thing becomes the final eventual state completed value of this p dot then, which means that now you can understand something like this, that if I have something like p2 is equal to this thing, and I do something like this p2, then p2 is a promise which resolves to 100. And that is why if you run, then you can see that this second thing is 100. So, and again if you console log p2, this is going to be a promise, we know that, right? So you can understand that p dot then generally does not return anything, but if you return something from there, then that becomes available as the new data for the next promise. If you resolve on this whole promise, if you are doing dot then that is available here. And this is just a long way of writing this. We know that this is a promise, so why to so this chaining which I was discussing, right? So this chaining is a common practice to use that. Just you have to be aware that from where are you returning what, and that is, so let's say from here I am returning 100, from here I am returning 20, and I have another, let's say dot then here, right? And then I am returning, let's say 50, right? So the whole point is that you can see that 120 all these are printed, right? And where does this 50 go? This 50 goes to like the whole thing. So if I have another dot then here, and let's say d. So what is happening is that this whole thing is a chain of things, you can understand, right? And all the values are passed. So but generally you will not do something like this. Generally what will happen, that in this last then it is, you are not returning anything, which means that this is almost done, and then you put a catch, and generally this then will not be used, the catch, and finally if you want to use finally, most cases they will be the final ones, right? So the catch will be the final one. However, in rare scenario, let's say in some scenario you want to again start another promise chain. So from here, if you again start returning some value, so let's see that. So let's say here, from here you return let's say 500, right? And from here you return let's say 50. Okay, and here you have dot catch. Dot then means after the whole thing you have dot then, and you are printing d. What is the d going to be printed? You see that it is 50. Why? Because this whole thing is successful, and that's why this catch was never executed, right? And that's why when this we are talking about this, then the whole, this whole thing including catch, since the catch will not be executed, including catch, the whole thing's resolved value will be a promise that resolves to 50, right? And if there was some error, so let's say some qq, some this thing was wrong, then you see that it is 500. Why? Because now let's say directly when I started to resolve that, the first moment only I got an error, and I directly landed in catch part. Now after catch part again you are returning 500, which means that whatever this whole thing which is a promise, this resolves to the value which is returned by catch, so that will be 500, and that's why here 500 is being printed. More importantly, this thing will directly at the beginning only it is giving error, but more importantly, let's write something here. So let's say log promise one called. So what I'm trying to show is that what are the various things called at various points of time if some error is happening. So yeah, let these be like that only. And this is promise 2, this is promise 3. Okay, so basically we have 3 thens, and then in all of them 1 2 3 is written, and then there is a finally there is a catch, and then at the end there is again one then. This is generally, I'm just showing you right now, but generally this will never be, mostly not be used. Only some thens and followed by catch will be there, or finally will be there, or then and catch, then catch and finally all will be there. But the point I'm making is that simply see what is happening. Promise 1 called, promise 2 called, promise 3 called, and finally the answer is 50, which was from the last successful promise. That is what is printing right now. Let's say some error happened here. Let's say error happened means either it intentionally happened or you threw the error. So let's right now we want to throw error just to artificially create the error, and let's say I'm saying something went wrong. Okay, let's see what happens. You can clearly see that the data has come successfully, and that's why I'm going inside this first then, and that's why the promise one is called is printed. But after that, in that block only, I printed let's say right now there is no point of this return, but I'm saying that if some condition is there, if something is true, then I don't want I am declaring that this thing is not what I expected. In that case you throw the error. If you throw the error, then you can see that promise 2 and promise 3 is not called. You can understand, from here it directly jumped to this catch. And then something went wrong is printed here, right? And just to show that after that again all the chain of then will continue. So you can see that from here 500 was returned, then again the next then the 500 is there, right? So but the basic idea is that if there is a catch and there is a chain of thens, if anywhere the thing is error is happening, then it will go to the next catch rather than going to the in between thens, it will not go, right? So similarly, if let's say here sorry, so let's say something this error was thrown in the second promise, right? Then we'll see that promise 1 promise 2 called and then error. So in a similar manner, whatever we saw that wherever this thing will be there, here we are seeing that promise third promise is also called. But the point is that whatever, whether it is immediately next catch or after a few thens, in between if any then is there, that will be completely skipped and we will land on the next catch directly. Okay, so this is the last time I'm using this dot then in the end, just to show you I was using that. But the point is that you can have a number of thens followed by catch. Okay, and that is what I'm saying it here again, that you can have a number of thens followed by catch, or you can not have any catch, or finally you can simply have all dot thens. But in this case, you know that if any error will happen, then it will crash your whole code. So definitely it is best to have a bunch of thens, and then finally you must have a catch at least, so that you can handle any error in case either directly this promise is rejected or any error is when you are handling any of the thens. In all cases, everything will be caught by this callback. Okay, so always try to avoid nesting of promises. So what is nesting of promises? You see that let's say this is a first promise P1. This is a first promise P1, right? And yeah, I got the data. Let's rather print that data. So data 1, and that data is this thing. So rather than chaining, I'm claiming that there is something called nesting, and you could have done that very well, but I am suggesting that that should not be done. But firstly, let's see what I'm talking about. So yeah, this is clear that data 1 this is successfully got. But let's say right now I have not showed you the whole thing, that how to extract this data. But let's say I have got this data, and in this piece of data some piece of information is there, using which I created another promise. So right now this return thing is also not needed, let's remove that. So I'm saying that using this data, whatever is data, I created some another URL. Let's say URL 2. This is the URL 1. This whole part is, let's say, URL 1. Rather than writing there, we could create a variable also, that is fine. But the point is that some URL 1 was there, but the data I got, from this data I have got some value using which I can create another URL 2. So I am right now saying that using this data some, so let's say from this data I will get some piece of information, using that I can construct a new URL. You understand the point? Why I am making that if it is completely independent, then you can write separately here. What is the point? But I am saying that until and unless this data comes, until unless that time point of time, I cannot create this URL2. That is my claim. Okay, we'll see that later. But right now let's just take another. So let's say another URL. Let's say 2. Okay, so this URL is separate URL. So let's say that this URL for the time being is this thing. Again, these two URLs are independent, but I am saying that this data, this URL is created using some data from data 2. Now let's see what are the options. What are the options? I am interested in the resolved data from URL 2, which was created from the data which was resolved from URL 1. Okay. Now this URL 2, if I have to hit that endpoint, right, then similarly I can here also create another promise, which is this thing, right? Now I can do something like same thing. I can do something like p dot then, right, and I can say data 2. data 2, and then let's print that data. That data 2 is this data. So you can understand that the code is slightly getting complicated, but data 1 data 2 is coming successfully, right? That is fine. uh, but what if something goes wrong in, let's say here the second URL is something wrong? Then you can see that it is uncaught. You might be surprised that I have a dot catch here. Then why it is saying that, in fact, this double arrow, this thing is not printed at all. You can see that this is not printed at all. Whatever the error happened, that somehow throwed the error out of the whole thing. And that is the problem actually, because this catch is only responsible for its then chain, whatever dot then or multiple dot thens. This catch is only responsible for it. Once directly it is not getting any error. After that, this then has scheduled some other fetch. This then has scheduled some other fetch. This is another fetch completely. Its callback is completely different, right? So now this catch is not responsible for these things. In fact, if you want to handle that, then like here, you have to properly write your own catch here. Let's say with single arrow instead of double arrow. I'm putting single arrow to distinguish that this is a separate thing handled, right, for this thing. Now you see that this is being not uncaught. This is properly caught by this thing, right? Okay, that is the first problem, that I cannot keep on writing like so many anywhere. Like there can be many types of errors at every point when I'm doing something. At every point of time, I don't want to keep on adding these sort of error handling. I want my error handling to be done at one place. That is one problem, right? Second problem is that this thing is something sort of, you understand, the same thing which is happening here again. I might have a URL3. I might have a URL3 which is dependent on this thing. Let's say URL3, right? And the whole story starts all over again. Let's say you can understand that this whole thing starts all over again, where URL3 is there, and I'm creating a p3 some third promise, and then p3, and then data 3, and you can understand, and then you can create another URL data 4. You can understand. You see that the problem is that this piece of code is getting nested and slightly complicated to analyze also, right? So what happens is that this is a bad way of doing these things, right? So I just showed you firstly that what is the problem, and then we are going to understand that what is the solution. So rather than firstly having our own promise here and then handling p dot then here, right, we can use a trick which we already know. What? That instead of doing our p dot then here, what if we simply return p2 from here? Now what happens? We know that dot then is also returns also a promise, which means that if I write another dot then here, then that is fine. And here we will get data 2. Okay, but but the problem is that how are we claiming this to be true? That is, how are we claiming this to be true? Earlier what happened is that I showed you that, yeah, I returned 50, and then this data 2 was 50. Right now I'm not returning 50, rather than I'm returning a promise. This p2 is a promise, right? And then also I'm saying that this thing is data 2, which is not p2, rather the value which p2 resolves to. So that is the point which I wanted to make here, is that when you return something from inside then in the next chain of then, the value might not be directly the value which you are returning. If that returned value is a promise, then it follows that promise. It follows that promise, which means that it in turn waits for that promise's resolved value, and that can be like nested to any level. So this data will be the final eventual value given by all the followed chains of promises. Understand? So we'll see by some example quickly. So this is what I was saying, that if I return a promise, if I return simply a value 5, then this data was 5. That was simple, right? But the claim I'm making, that a promise always resolves to a non-promise value, which means that this whole thing from here to here, we know that promise dot then, this whole thing returns a promise. So this promise dot then, when I'm doing this data is 5 right now. But instead of 5, if I again return a promise from here, but then I'm claiming that a promise always resolves a non-promise value, which means that this data cannot be a promise. If I return 5, then this is 5. If I return a promise, then this cannot be a promise. In fact, what happens that if I return a promise, then this data will again be that promise, whatever I'm returning, that's resolved value. That will be this promise. That will be this data, piece of data, right? And that's why this thing is working. That's why this thing is working. So to prove that, if you return let's say hello, and you run it, and let's keep all the URLs correct, then you see that data 1 is data 1 is obviously printed correctly. Data 2 is hello. So if I'm returning hello, then that data 2 is hello. But instead of hello, if I'm returning p2, then p2 is a promise. So data 2 is not a promise, rather data 2 is a resolved value of that promise. What is the resolved value of this promise? The data which comes from this second URL, which is again another data response, right? So if you clearly see that this data, again this is a proper response. I'm not getting a promise, I'm getting a resolved value of that promise. Okay, and again why I'm creating a separate variable and returning that variable, you can directly return this only, right? So this thing will be also fine. Yeah, so this was the story when I'm trying to return a promise, but you understood that so this is what I was saying, that if you return a fetch URL, if you return a fetch URL's return value, which means that if fetch URL's return value is again a promise, so this data will not be a promise. The data will be the response which you get from this promise resolution. Okay. Now you understand that every time whenever the word promise comes, I have no way to create a promise. We earlier claimed that later we will learn how to create promises, our own promises. But right now, whenever, even for example, I want to have some promise, I'm always using fetch, right? Fetch is like network request. Is there a simple way to get a promise, or not create a promise? Means I don't want to create my own full-fledged promise, but let's say some 10 value is there. But I don't want 10. I want a promise which resolves to 10. It is as simple as that. Or let's say I want to have a promise which rejects with some value, which means that it should not give me an error, rather it should give me a promise which rejects with that error. Understand? So these sort of simple things, I'm not creating my own promise, but for these sort of simple things, JavaScript has inbuilt methods which can be helpful for us. So you can understand that there is a function called promise, there is a function called promise.resolve, and this is a static function, which means that capital PROMISE, this is not some object, this is like your promise class directly on that, like array.is array method was there, right, which was available directly on array, statically on array class rather than on some array object, right? So similarly, this capital PROMISE, as it is, this thing is a promise object, but this thing is a promise class directly on that. If you do something like promise.resolve, then this whole thing is actually a promise. This whole thing is a promise that resolves to 5, right? Which means that if I wanted to let's take a simple example. So rather than having this uh, chained, then let's, for right now, let's comment this whole thing and have a simple uh, data and error log. And now I don't want this fetch always for creating your creating promises. Let's take a p1, and this thing is, I'm saying that promise dot resolve, and let's say 100. Now if you print this thing, then you see that data 2 is 100, or whatever data 1, whatever you write here, so that thing is 100. Now what is happening is that you can clearly see that if you print this thing, let's say you print this thing p1, then you will see that this thing is a promise. But the difference is that you can see that this is not pending. When we printed fetch URL, then obviously it was pending, it went on to do the network request, then when the result will come back, then it will give you the resolved or reject answer, right? So right now it is pending, but we know that this is like a helper function for quickly get some resolved or rejected value, right? So in this case, this is a resolved value. There is something called promise.reject also, which is for rejected value. We'll come back to it soon. But the point is that I don't want 100. I just want a promise which resolves to 100. Why it is important? Because sometimes might be the whole code base, rest of the code base is in promise structure, and for one value I don't want to change the semantics. I still want a promise. But let's say in all the other cases it was giving a promise. Then in the error scenario also, let's say you want a promise which resolves to null or something, rather than returning null directly. Okay, that sort of scenario might be helpful where this sort of things is needed. Okay, so we can see that this thing is a already fulfilled promise. But then even if it is fulfilled, even if it is fully, if I have not mentioned it earlier, that this dot then, it does not mean that uh, if it is already pending, then only dot then will work. In fact, for fetch also, let's say it's not that it is already pending, then dot then will happen. Even if you, let's say you do some set timeout and you you attach this p1 dot then after 5 seconds, and within 1 second that result has come from fetch, then also this will work. Okay, it's just that whatever is the whenever this thing is this dot then is attached, then that time the promise will check that if it is pending, then it has just scheduled this callback, that later when it will get fulfilled, then I will call this callback. But when I am attaching dot then, and that time the promise checks that it is already fulfilled, then that's fine. I don't need to wait. I already have a value, and I will directly call this callback with that data, whatever I have, right? That is what is happening here. This P1 is, it gives us immediately a promise which resolves with 100. Okay, and this as soon as I'm printing p1, I'm already seeing that this is a fulfilled promise with 100 value, right? And but then this is a promise, so all the semantics of promise will be like that. So p1 dot then, and then when I do this things, then all I can see that this data is printed correctly as 100. Now there is a similar thing called promise.reject, and then you can pass some information, some message, or something, some error message or something, right? That, you know what, this was the reason because of which this got rejected. I'm rejecting this from here. So it's like throw, right? So what happens that in throw, if by default JavaScript is throwing some error, then it's fine, some syntax error. But let's say everything is fine from JavaScript point of view, but value wise you're not satisfied with some condition and you want to throw error, then you can write your own throw sort of thing, right? You can understand like this, that yeah, and that sort of throw is also there in inside the inside here. So let's say you want to throw error something from some. So firstly let's see this thing and then we will see that thing also. So you can see that promise rejected. So when I'm printing immediately, p1, then it is saying that it is a promise and it is already rejected. Meaning it is not. So promise.resolve will give you a fulfilled or resolved promise. Promise.reject will give you already a rejected promise. No one will give you a pending one. Okay. And yeah, when you print that error, and again error.message is not available because what is happening is that maybe some message, whatever you are passing here, that thing is directly available here, right? If you pass here rather than a string, if you pass here let's say a new error, right? Then sorry, let's run it here. Then you see that now this is a completely full-fledged error object, and then you can have your own, like since this is a full-fledged error object, then you can have error dot name, error dot message. But then the point is that whatever you are passing as the argument of reject, that is going to come here in case it is rejected, and we know that this promise is already rejected, so definitely it will always come here. This data one will never be printed, always this thing will be printed, we know that, right? So you can clearly see that this error and some message, whatever is there, that thing is coming. Okay, now next thing I was saying that yeah, this promise is fine. Let's say this p1 is a valid promise, p1 dot then not p1 dot then const p1 is equal to new promise, and it resolves with some value, let's say 10. And let's say there is another promise p2, and I'm saying that it is from inside. So earlier we saw two things, right? And let's say return p2. Okay, so let's say right now I am throw new error. Okay, resolver is not a function. What is happening? Okay, yeah, okay, wait. I just mistyped it. Yeah, so basically this thing is a promise, and now promise will definitely, this is a resolved promise, so definitely it will go inside inside this thing, promise dot oh sorry, not new, I just mistyped it. So promise.resolve directly returns a promise, and now this data one is definitely going to be printed, but I'm not interested in that. I'm saying that I'm trying to set up a scenario where it is throwing an error, right? And that error, let's simply print that error for now. That error will be available in catch block. And now let's say instead of throw new error, I create a promise reject and return that. What will happen? You understand that now I'm saying we discussed that, right? That if you return something, then that is the promise on which this catch is running, or whatever the next thing is running. Now this thing which on which I'm running this the promise on which I'm running this catch is a rejected promise. So definitely this rejection will also come here. You can clearly see that again I'm getting the same answer. So just a way of saying that instead of this and again this thing, rather than returning p2, you can directly return it like this, right? And also both are fine. And also if we know that, see, this new error message is like a sort of so you can have a new variable, let's say const my error or something, and this error object either you can throw, that is one way you can do. Another way you can do that, you can reject it with that error object, right? And both will work. Okay, fine. So yeah, most of the things are done here. We discussed also about callback hell, that if there is a fetch inside that data, inside again there is a fetch. So you can see this sort of we discussed with 2 or 3 fetches, right? Let's say there is a 4 or 5 fetch, and again this is like a simple there will be like multiple lines of code, and the whole code will be like this pyramid shaped. So this pyramid shape of code, that style of code, is called callback hell. And we are also discussed that the chaining of promises allowed us to avoid that callback hell by chaining the promises. So rather than using that pyramid shape, the same thing can be done from here. So rather than doing this some p2 some promise and dot then inside this, we will simply return that promise, and then in the flat structure later we will do a dot then, and there we will handle. And again if some new promise is there, we will again return that. So you see that the whole pyramid shape of code is converted to a flat shape of code, which improves the readability. And this is the way to use promises. Some people who don't know this behavior, that returning some value or even returning a new promise, the chained next value resolves to the value which is returned from the previous dot. Then if you don't know that information, then you will be tempted in the first time to write callback hell style of code, because you think that, yeah, my data is there, now I created some url and then I got some some promise, then you will be tempted to use dot then there only. But we understood like too many problems with that, right? Error handling, not proper error handling, and inconsistent behavior, the pyramid shaped sort of callback hell. So these things we don't want, right? We want a unified error handling, right? A flat code structure, no, those sort of things, which will be helpful if we know this fact. And we have also seen that promise.resolve resolves to a value which we give, right? One more thing I'll say, that if promise.resolve, if you don't provide a value, if you don't provide a value, if you provide a promise again. So let's see here. Now I'm not going to reject anything, I'm going to simply write the value. But let's say this thing is not a value, rather this thing is again a promise. So let's say some p0, and this p0 is again a promise. So const p0 is and again I can create this promise also using like promise.resolve some value, and this resolve, let's say 500. Then what do you think this thing is going to happen? What is the so you see 500 is printed. So what is happening is that if you pass a value, then this is p0 is a promise which resolves to 500. If you pass a promise to promise.resolve, then this promise is essentially same as this promise. This transparently bypasses. You can understand that whatever promise you provide, the promise.resolve provides you that promise also. In fact, you can check that by just printing something. Let's say is p0 and p1 are the same base addresses, and you can see that the true is printed, which means that essentially p0 and p1 not only resolve to the same value, they are exactly the same promise internally in the memory also. So it just returns you that value. Just to know that sometimes I don't know, like sometimes the value which you are passing turns out to be a promise, then your code will not crash. And why it is not crashing, this is the reason, because then it gives you that promise only, that doesn't matter. So promise.resolve 5, that is fine. And we can use that promise, the example which we took earlier. Similarly, the reject and that promise, we have to give a reason. This is called a reason, some string, some data, any sort of value you can pass, and that will be available in the catch error. Whatever you are passing here, that will be available as this error object, right? And again, this thing, if this thing is a full-fledged error object, then this error will be also a full-fledged error object. Okay, and now you understand that fetch, when fetch internally, let's say some domain or some error happened, then fetch internally internally returns a instance of error. So this error object it is returning, and that's why in case of fetch we saw that in the error object which we got, it had error.name and error.name and error.message is a like is a standard. These two properties are standard ones which are available on error objects which are created from error class, and you can check those by using instance of error, as we saw earlier in some of the earlier videos. Okay, so that will be all for now. This is getting pretty long, so we'll see more topics in the next one. Thanks.